In this next section, we're going to talk about faith integration and academic program development. For those of you who aren't at faith-based institutions, you could view this as a general critique of Western approaches to academia and probably learn some things, or you feel free to skip this. So one critical thing to think about is how you get faith integration at various outcome levels in your organization. So, as I mentioned before, you have your mission, and then under that, you're going to have your institutional learning outcomes that all graduates will have. But what's really important to realize is that the most critical points for faith integration are going to be at these higher levels. So the institutional learning outcomes that you're going to try to get all your students to have, your program learning outcomes, and your general education learning outcomes. So a lot of the emphasis is focused on a course-by-course basis, and that's important. But the depth of faith integration is going to vary based on the course subject. And then, every unit doesn't need to have, a Bible verse attached to it. What's important is that the whole has the faith integration. And for those who might be looking at this from secular institutions, you could take all these principles I'm saying about faith integration and say, institutional values that make your organization unique. And then you'll have, various assessments and content. So the level of depth of faith integration is going to vary across different subjects. So this chart here shows that in some fields like mathematics, you don't need as much faith integration, and natural sciences. But as you move more, into things like history, philosophy, literature and the arts, theology, then you're going to have a very different approach to things. Now, it's important to still train, what the rest of the world thinks, but at the same time, whenever you're talking about worldviews, what you're doing at a Christian institution is you're teaching people about a Christian worldview. That's what they've signed up for. So whenever we design our courses at City Vision, one of the things we do is we identify how much faith integration is desired for each course. And a course that we have, say, in Christian counseling is going to have very deep faith integration, whereas a course in mathematics, not as much. And part of the reason why that's important is for a lot of schools, they're very limited on budget. And if you have, infinite money, then you can do integration in a lot of things. But a lot of times it's helpful to just take things off the shelf and use courseware for math. And it just costs more to do that integration, on each course, but you can do it within the degree. So the next part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Western bias in academic institutions, especially in Bloom's domain. So a lot of the sources for this I've learned personally, but one of the books that I found most helpful on this is a book called Transforming Theological Education. And there's a tendency of Western faith-based institutions to significantly overvalue the cognitive domain of learning and to devalue affective and psychomotor. So part of the reason for that is it's strongly reinforced by accreditation structures that focus on assessment of outcomes that are more easily measured. Now, everyone says, oh, you can measure affective and psychomotor, but it's a lot harder. And if that's all you do, you're probably going to be in trouble with your accreditors. So, and the end result is that you have a process that teach objectivism. And, we say that as Christian institutions, we don't support a value structure that's pure secular rationalism. But if our processes and our, our assessment that focuses on the cognitive domain, they're going to learn from what you value, if that's what you're testing on. So I think it's critical to be intentional both at the program level and institutional level to offset this bias and within courses. So to emphasize more the affective domain, you need to invest in mentoring, practicum, community among students, service learning, spiritual formation, journalism, creative expression. Like if you're teaching someone, worship, then that's going to be important. And then, doing questions that are focused on affective, the affective domain. And then psychomotor, invest more in and grant credit for internships, practicum, service learning, co-ops, and field experience. I was recently talking with a partner, and they have very strong practicum, an internship. It was actually, working with them on an internship, and they weren't going to grant credit for it. And I was trying to say, that creates a Western bias. So we need to find a way to offset that. And I think that that's something that's important. Now, there's many quotes that I pulled out of this book that I just thought were great, that are helpful on the challenges we face with faith integration in a Western accreditation system. So while we teach orally that the Word became flesh, too often we teach psychologically and methodologically that the Word became text. So in the Word, being Jesus, Jesus was not text, he became flesh. Another one is in theological education, the easier, and I would say this is in Christian education too, the easier something is to assess, the less important that something is likely to be. And the third quote is, no truth is taught by words or learned by intellectual means. Truth must be lived into meaning before it can be truly known. So I think those are all just emphasizing the challenge that we have in order to do this well. So another way of thinking about this that actually came out of that same book is, if you overemphasize one domain of learning, what's going to be your result? So if you overemphasize the cognitive domain, then you're going to have pride and irrelevance. If you overemphasize the affective domain, you're going to have ignorant pietism and emotionalism. If you overemphasize the behavioral domain, then you're going to have empty technical excellence. And you can see to a certain extent these differences in some ways are some of the denominational differences that we have. Some denominations are comfortable with the heart and others the head and others the hands. But at the end of the day, we're trying to create healthy people and or help shape healthy people. And Christian integration needs to not only integrate faith, but it needs to provide a holistic balance across all three domains of learning to do that. So let's talk a little bit about the affective domain. So Krathwohl's affective domain taxonomy, it starts with just people receiving, and you can think of this almost like, say someone attends a church, right? And receiving would be they show up to church. Responding out, you've probably seen people who someone dragged them to church. They don't want to worship. They're just sitting there because their wife or husband told them. And they're not, doing a whole lot, but so you would be moving from receiving to responding if you start to participate. And then valuing would be, okay, you're not just participating in worship, but you're actually going to place value on the things they're teaching you. And then the organization would be, you're starting to realize, okay, I'm realizing that some of these things in my lifestyle of, maybe I'm drinking or doing drugs or, sleeping around, or being selfish or, whatever, you're prioritizing a Christian value above that. And then the internalizing values would mean that you've internalized the values and that affects your behavior. So just like with Bloom's verbs, there's various verbs that you can use. And the challenge is in assessing these. And in many ways, it becomes harder to assess, especially if you're in an online environment. But you can, word questions in ways and do things like journaling. A lot of the, way that you can assess these things might be through journaling and through, having a mentor that provides input. Because if you're just asking someone, someone signs up for a course and you just say, hey, do you internalize all this stuff? Then they're going to say, why, yes, I do. But if you're having them journal about it and you're having them interact with a mentor or supervisor, then that's going to have much more, significant impact. Now, another practice I think that's helpful is to have faith integration items, and we talk about having course evaluation rubrics, and program evaluation rubrics is what we're going to talk about in more depth later. It can be helpful to have items in those actual rubrics. So as I mentioned, one of the things we do, we have our customized course evaluation rubric, and we identify our courses based on the level of faith integration desired and compare it to what's actually there. And the idea also is, if you're creating this course evaluation rubric, would be to tie your rubric in with your institutional learning outcomes and your general education outcomes where possible, if they contribute to those things. So the last thing that I'm going to go into before I just give an overview of some of the materials is just to recognize that it's a best practice of faith-based institutions to put many of your faith-integrated learning outcomes in general education and institutional learning outcomes, or some people call that the ideal graduate profile. So I'm going to show you some of the sample research links on that, and then I'm going to emphasize a couple key tools that are out there. There's some tools out there to do spiritual assessments. Now, anytime you try to objectively assess someone's spiritual life, that creates a bias by itself, but it can also still be a helpful tool. And there's a group called the International Council for Christian Higher Education that has a lot of free resources that I would encourage you to take a look at. So for the last part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the materials for this week, partly because I just want to emphasize them. So this is what you'll see in Udemy as you go through. And we have a lot of reading. There's a lot more stuff, and I'd like to go deeper, but honestly, some of the best resources that are out there aren't ours. So we're referring you to them. A lot of really good reading, some excellent videos that are helpful. And then there's these samples of faith integration that I'll talk about at the general education level and institutional level. And then there's links to these spiritual assessment tools that are out there, and some other optional resources and books. So now let me just go into some examples. So I'd already referenced this general education research sample. APU really is one of the best models I've seen out there to learn from, and they have general education. Actually, let me start with the institutional learning objectives, because this shows, so this is their organization vision, but this is what they want each person graduating to have. So they want to be able to explain the relevance of Jesus Christ and his teaching to their major discipline, personal and professional values, ethics, and commitments, explain how scripture, tradition, experience, and reason contribute to the students' understanding of God's purposes and their personal, social, and professional choices. And then some of these other things, I think how they approach service and community also is going to be related to faith. So, as you're designing not just your program, you can also think about how do you integrate that into your institutional learning objectives. And the same thing with general education. So APU serves as a good model of general education, where they have general education around biblical and theological equipping. And what I did in this spreadsheet here, again, is to try to align those. If you go down to the faith integration and ethical reasoning, you can see how those align at APU, and then I've also aligned with Grand Canyon and some others that are out there on institutional learning. And you can also see some of the courses that are some of the foundational courses that they use in terms of general education, but especially related to faith. Often it's common to have a Christian worldview course as general education. So the idea is, as you're developing your program outcomes, so you're going to be working in your curriculum map, and there's a section on your curriculum map where you're going to be developing your program outcomes. You want to be thinking about, okay, what of your program outcomes are going to integrate faith? Now, obviously, they don't all need to integrate faith, but you probably want to have some if you're at a faith-based institution. So thanks a lot. And the next section is going to go into a more specific, how do you integrate into specific courses, faith integration in specific courses, and things along those lines. So thanks a lot.